A truck driver's assistant from Florida won $30 million in the lottery. A few years later, he was found buried under a layer of concrete in the backyard of a stranger's house. And in between, almost a year during which his family kept getting messages from him. "I've gone away, don't look for me." Except Abraham Shakespeare could barely write. So, who was typing those words when Abraham himself was already dead? What follows is a story about how a woman promised to protect another man's money and ended up costing him his fortune and his life, and how one hidden microphone brought down everything she had built on lies. It all begins with a single winning ticket. Abraham Lee Shakespeare lived the way millions of working people live in the small towns of Florida. A truck driver's assistant from Lakeland, no education, barely able to read and write. His world was shifts, the road, modest pay, and debts that followed him everywhere he went. Nobody around him expected that one day the whole country would know his name. On the 15th of November, 2006, everything changed in a single evening. Abraham won $30 million in the Florida lottery. Not a raise, not an inheritance. A sum that turns a working man into a rich one in an instant. He didn't choose payments stretched out over years. He took it all at once. After taxes, he was left with about $17 million in cash. The money changed the scenery almost immediately. Abraham bought a house for $1,100,000 in a gated community where people from a completely different world lived. There was a new car. On his wrist, expensive watches, the kind he used to see only in store windows. From the outside, it was a pure dream come true. The man had gotten incredibly lucky. But in Florida, the law is set up so that the name of a lottery winner becomes public, open information, available to anyone. And in that one detail lies the beginning of the tragedy. Now, it wasn't just family and friends who knew about Abraham's win. The whole town knew, the whole state knew, anyone who could read the news. From that day on, an invisible line formed at his door. Requests for money came from everywhere, from acquaintances, from people he barely knew, from total strangers with stories prepared in advance. A man who had counted every dollar his whole life suddenly found himself surrounded by people counting his money for him. Good fortune had turned into a trap, and Abraham couldn't yet see a way out. Soon all of this became the backdrop of his new life. Phone calls, visits, letters, conversations in the parking lot. Everyone came with their own misfortune and their own number. Someone needed money for treatment, someone for housing, someone simply because they'd heard Abraham had money to spare. Shakespeare didn't know how to say no. He handed out money left and right, almost without thinking. No record keeping, no accountant to stop him, no habit of writing down who got what. A man who had spent his whole life without any savings simply didn't know what it meant to keep millions under control. He shared the way he was used to sharing his last dollar, only now that last dollar came in tens and hundreds of thousands. His fortune melted away faster than he could notice. 17 million seems bottomless, right up until you start looking at what's left. And there was no one to look. The money went to other people's requests, to purchases, to people who appeared and disappeared. One day he said something to his brother that people would later quote most often, that he'd be better off without the money. There's no posturing in those words, only the exhaustion of a man who realized the win hadn't made him freer. Quite the opposite. The wealth had drawn in those who found him interesting, only because of the numbers in his account. And that's how the portrait of the perfect victim comes together. Generous, trusting, unable to refuse, bad at keeping track of his own money. Lots of money and almost no protection, neither legal nor human. Already circling around him were those who saw not Abraham, but his bank balance. And then a person of an entirely different sort appeared. Not just another beggar with an outstretched hand, but someone with an offer. Someone who promised not to take, but to put things in order. That's exactly how she got closer than anyone. At the turn of 2008 and 2009, a woman named Doris Moore appeared in Abraham's life. A woman everyone knew as Dee Dee. She was nothing like the beggars crowding at his door. She carried herself with confidence, spoke like a woman of business, and came not with an empty plea but with a project. She introduced herself as a businesswoman. She said she wanted to write a book about Shakespeare's life, about that very path from poverty to a huge win that the public loves so much. The story of a poor man who became a millionaire really does sound like a ready-made bestseller, and to Abraham, worn down by other people's greed, it was flattering. someone finally saw him not as an ATM, but as a hero. Her main argument hit the bullseye. Moore said she wanted to protect him, to shield him from those who were fleecing him, as if she were extending a hand to a man drowning in other people's requests. For Abraham, who couldn't refuse and lost money faster than he could count it, this sounded like salvation. At last, someone beside him who would take all the chaos under control. Except Dee Dee Moore herself had a past that Abraham most likely knew nothing about. A conviction for insurance fraud in the early 2000s, a false report of a crime, financial troubles all the way to bankruptcy. This is the biography not of a philanthropist, but of someone who had already once built schemes around money and the law. Once she had gained his trust, Moore moved fast. She didn't stay a polite advisor somewhere on the edge of his life. She took control of his finances, became the person through whom all decisions about money passed, step by step, and there she was, closer to his accounts than anyone in his family. And now everything came down to one question. Who was she really? A savior who promised protection and kept her word, or a predator who had found the perfect prey? The answer began to show through the paperwork. Moore set up a company called Abraham Shakespeare LLC, a company with Abraham's name on the sign, but arranged so that the real control over the money was hers. On paper, it was him. At the helm, it was her. A legal shell through which a fortune can be moved almost unnoticed. Through this company, Shakespeare's assets flowed into her hands. What used to be his account turned into a stream managed by someone else, and that stream went in one direction. According to investigators, Moore withdrew about $1 million from the accounts. The money almost immediately turned into things that were hard to miss. In February of 2009, a Chevrolet Corvette appeared for around $70,000. In early March, a Hummer for nearly $90,000. Then a truck on top of that. That's not how you help a friend sort out his finances. That's a collection of expensive vehicles bought against the backdrop of Abraham's rapidly emptying accounts. When questions came up later, Moore had a ready answer. All of this, gifts from Abraham himself. According to her version, the generous lottery winner had simply decided to lavish gifts on the woman who was helping him put his affairs in order. A convenient version. It lifts the responsibility off her and explains any transfer. There's just one problem. There's no proof of it. Not a single document where Shakespeare agreed to such spending. Nothing to show that Abraham himself understood and approved of his money walking away. Only her word, and the fact that the cars and assets all ended up with her. And against this backdrop comes a question that sends a chill down your spine. While the fortune melts and flows into someone else's hands, where is Abraham himself? The purchases have stopped. His voice is heard less and less. The money is moving, and the man whose name is written on the company seems to have stepped back into the shadows. What comes next is the fatal line. In early April of 2009, Abraham Shakespeare was last seen alive in the Lakeland area. An ordinary man in an ordinary place. None of the people who crossed paths with him then realized they were becoming the last witnesses. Technology gives the exact date. On the 6th of April, the last activity from his cell phone was recorded. After that, the signal cut off, and with it, any reliable contact with the living Abraham. The man who had spent his whole life surrounded by people reaching out their hands seemed to vanish into thin air. Not a single friend, not a single relative, ever saw him again with their own eyes. Later, a detail would surface that makes your skin crawl. Dee Dee Moore's ex-husband would say that it was in April that he dug a pit on one of the properties. At the time, it seemed like just work, a routine errand. And only many months later did it become clear what a horrifying picture this episode fits into. An ordinary pit, dug on an ordinary spring day. The most chilling thing here is the silence that followed. No one looked for the missing man. No alarm, no search parties, no announcements. To everyone around him, Abraham had simply gone away. A rich man, tired of the intrusive attention, had decided to hide from the world. A version that almost makes sense for someone who had publicly complained that he'd be better off poor. So no one asked any inconvenient questions. Everyone had a ready answer for any doubt, which meant there seemed to be no reason to worry. And so it went. For months. Spring gave way to summer, summer to autumn. Abraham's money kept moving, the cars kept driving, the papers kept getting signed, while he himself seemed to be somewhere far away. Half a year passed before anyone dared to say out loud what had long been hanging in the air. Something is wrong with Abraham, and it's time to raise the alarm. The living Abraham was already gone, yet his voice still echoed in his loved ones' phones. After April, his family kept getting messages that seemed to be written by him. On the screen, a familiar name, and it seemed like the man was in touch, that he was fine. The content was always roughly the same. Abraham had gone away and didn't want to be bothered. He was sick of the attention, sick of the requests, and had decided to live far away from everyone. The destinations varied: Texas one time, Jamaica another, Puerto Rico the next. The geography changed, but the meaning was the same. Don't look for me, I'm fine. This picture is reassuring right up until someone starts reading closely. And that's where the first crack appears. His loved ones grew uneasy. Shakespeare could barely write. A man who could hardly manage to read was suddenly sending coherent, well-written messages, as if someone else entirely was speaking for him. And the gap was glaring. Acquaintances remembered how Abraham struggled with words, how embarrassed he was about being illiterate. What was arriving now didn't sound like him. That's how someone writes who's used to handling text. Suspicion settled in and began to grow. If Abraham couldn't write like that himself, then someone else was carrying on the correspondence for him. Someone with access to his phone and his life. Someone who benefited from everyone believing Abraham was alive and had simply gone away. And this person tried very hard. The messages came regularly, sustaining the illusion of his presence. Each of them was a brick in the wall the killer was building to keep out the questions. But the longer the correspondence dragged on, the stronger the sense of falseness grew. The voice meant to convince everyone that Abraham was alive was, in fact, screaming louder and louder of the opposite. All it needed was for someone to finally listen. On the 9th of November, 2009, the family's patience finally broke. They officially reported Abraham missing. What had remained an anxious gut feeling for months turned into a document, an appeal to the authorities, a demand for answers. And right away they emphasized an important detail. Abraham hadn't been seen since April, not recently, not a couple of weeks ago, half a year. All that time only messages came in his name, while the living man was nowhere to be found. When this simple timeline was spoken out loud, the illusion of "he just went away" began to fall apart. The police took up the investigation. Detectives began to reconstruct the picture, where Abraham was last seen, who he called, who was handling his money, and who was running the correspondence. And almost immediately all the threads converged on a single point. Again and again, the same name came up: Dee Dee Moore. Moore herself acted as if nothing unusual was going on. She insisted Abraham was alive, and repeated, word for word, that very legend from his messages, as if she'd memorized it by heart, and was now reciting it to the detectives without her face flinching for a second. In the newspapers, it was still filed under mystery: a working man on whom a fortune fell from the sky, and his equally sudden disappearance without a trace. A story that keeps you in suspense and doesn't demand a resolution. But that very simplicity is what deceives. Behind the version of a voluntary departure stand too many coincidences: transferred assets, fake messages, a person who controlled his money, and a hard question rose over the investigation. Did Abraham really vanish of his own free will? Or had someone very skillfully built a stage set behind which a far more terrible truth was hiding? The investigators went where, in cases like this, the truth usually hides: into the money. They studied the financial flows around Abraham and found a systematic transfer of his assets to Moore. What the bank documents painted looked nothing like the chaotic generosity of a rich man. It was a deliberate movement of funds in one direction. The paperwork confirmed a disturbing pattern. On the 9th of January, property was transferred to a company connected to Moore. Assets that should have stayed with Abraham, or at least under his control, were reassigned so that the beneficiary was her. Every such document was one more argument against the version of a voluntary departure. The deeper the investigators dug, the less faith remained in the legend of the runaway. A man who decides to hide from the world usually doesn't sign over all his property to an acquaintance. He doesn't leave behind a chain of transfers all leading to the same person. The "he just went away" version was bursting at the seams under the weight of the financial evidence. Moore's own behavior only deepened the suspicions. She kept changing her explanations, getting tangled in the details. What sounded confident yesterday contradicted her own words today. The truth doesn't lose details over time, but a made-up story sooner or later gives way. And those cracks were exactly what the investigators saw. Under pressure, Moore began to panic. She acted more and more frantically, trying to prop up her version with anything she could. She needed someone to confirm it. Abraham is alive, he's in touch, her story is true. That panic betrays a person whose ground is slipping out from under them. By this point, the investigation had reached a grim but increasingly obvious conclusion. The missing man was most likely already dead. Too many signs pointed to the fact that this wasn't a disappearance, but the cover-up of a death. The hardest part remained. How do you prove a crime when there's no body, no confession, no eyewitnesses, only papers, contradictions, and a growing sense that the truth is buried somewhere very deep? And the clue came to the investigation from Moore herself. Feeling the ring tighten around her, she tried to buy her own salvation, literally. It would later be established that she was looking for someone willing to take the blame for Shakespeare's death. For this service, she promised $50,000. And that was only part of her frantic maneuvering. Moore paid people to claim they had recently been in contact with Abraham. The more living voices said, yes, we saw him, we talked to him. The longer her version would hold up. Text messages were no longer enough. Now she needed people. But even that wasn't enough for her. She offered someone money to move the hidden body, an attempt that gives everything away at once. An innocent person doesn't hire people to move the body of the dead. This detail, which surfaced during the investigation, turned the abstract suspicions into something far more concrete and terrifying. The price Moore was willing to pay for silence and lies kept rising. It wasn't just money anymore, but property too. For false testimony, she offered a house worth around $200,000. To her, this was an investment in her own safety, an attempt to build a wall around herself out of bribed witnesses and fake alibis. Only every such step worked against her. Any attempt to buy someone's silence leaves a trace. People remember. Some agreed, some refused, and some went straight to the police. What was meant to cover the tracks turned into a new chain of evidence leading right to her. That's how Moore drove herself into a trap. The harder she tried to hide the truth, the more proof of her guilt she left behind. Her attempts to survive were turning into the case against her. And at some point, the circle of people she turned to for help inevitably led her to a man she took for an accomplice. Except, in reality, he turned out to be nothing like what he claimed to be. On the 21st of January, 2010, the police made the decisive move. An undercover informant was brought into Moore, a man named Mike Smith. On the surface, exactly the person she was looking for, ready to take someone else's guilt on himself for money. In reality, part of a carefully planned operation. Smith played his role flawlessly. He came across as exactly the accomplice Moore had been searching for, and she, exhausted by the fear of exposure, gradually opened up. It seemed to her that someone had finally appeared who would solve her main problem. Trusting that stranger became her fatal mistake. Step by step, she gave herself away. She led Smith to the place where a concrete slab had been poured. She pointed out the exact spot, like a person who knows precisely what is hidden and where. Only someone who had organized the cover-up would have led a casual acquaintance to that very place. And that's exactly how Moore behaved. What came next would become one of the key pieces of evidence. Moore handed Smith a .38 caliber revolver, the very weapon from which the fatal shot had been fired. The instrument of death passed from her hands into the hands of a man she believed to be her accomplice. She herself put into the case an object directly linking her to the crime. They spelled out the deal aloud. That very price Moore had been offering to different people for weeks finally came up in a specific conversation with a specific man. $50,000 for him to take it all on himself. For her, it was salvation. For the investigation, it was gold. Because all of it was being recorded. Every word and every confession was captured by hidden equipment. Conversations Moore believed to be secret were going on to tape and turning into irrefutable proof. The woman who had spent months building a wall of lies and bribery was, with her own hands, assembling the case against herself. One last step remained, to find out what was really hidden under that concrete slab to which she had led a stranger. On the 25th of January, 2010, the digging began in the backyard of a house in Plant City. For several days, until the 27th, the police methodically broke open the ground beneath the concrete slab. Each layer removed brought the investigation closer to the answer everyone feared and everyone awaited. What they found beneath the slab confirmed the worst fears. In the ground, they discovered remains. They had been hidden so that no one would ever find them. The layer of concrete on top was meant to seal the secret forever. For 9 months, the yard had looked like an ordinary plot of land, under which nothing terrible could possibly be. On the 29th of January, the identity was conclusively established. It was Abraham Shakespeare, the man whose name had surfaced for months in messages, in papers, in talk of a runaway who'd hidden from the world. There was no Texas, no Jamaica, no Puerto Rico. All that time, he had been right here, under this very yard. Forensics reconstructed the circumstances of the death. Abraham had died from a gunshot wound, not an accident, not an illness, and certainly not a voluntary departure. He had been killed, and it had been carefully disguised as an escape from the world. The time of death also fell into place. Death had come back in early April of 2009, exactly when his phone signal cut off, and when that very pit was dug. A date that had once been just a point on a timeline now took on a monstrous meaning, and now the whole mechanics of the deception became clear. For 9 months, Abraham lay under the yard while messages went out to his family in his name. While his loved ones read, "Don't look for me," he had long been dead. The illusion of his presence was being maintained right above the grave of the very man those messages were supposed to portray as alive. The secret sealed in concrete had been uncovered, but solving a crime and proving guilt in a courtroom are far from the same thing. Ahead lay the arrest, the charges, and the trial, where all this terrible knowledge still had to be turned into a verdict. After that, everything moved quickly. On the 2nd of February, 2010, Moore was arrested. Bail was set high, $1 million, which in itself speaks to the gravity of the suspicions. A woman who, not long before, had been handling someone else's millions found herself behind bars, awaiting trial. The formal charge followed a little over 2 weeks later. On the 19th of February, Moore was officially charged with first-degree murder, the most serious wording possible in a case like this. This was no longer talk of suspicions, but a concrete legal demand to answer for what had been done. The accused did not admit her guilt. On the 15th of March, she pleaded not guilty. From that moment began a long battle between the prosecution and the defense, each side building its own version of what had happened. The defense built its line on deflecting the blow. The lawyers put forward a version. Someone else was responsible for Abraham's death, not their client. They tried to sow doubt and to present Moore, at most, as a participant in someone else's scheme. The goal was to turn the jury's certainty into at least a hesitation. But the prosecution had plenty to put on the table, too. In its hands were the informant's recordings, those of that same Mike Smith, to whom Moore had shown the spot with the slab and handed over the weapon. On tape were her words, her actions, her readiness to pay for someone's silence, direct evidence that she knew everything. To this was added the weapon. The .38 caliber revolver that Moore handed to the informant directly linked her to how Abraham had died. And over all of it lay the documents on the transfer of assets. They explained the main thing, the reason it had all been set in motion. The money flowing to Moore painted the motive more clearly than any words. A powerful picture was taking shape. Motive, weapon, and recorded confessions. And yet one question hung over the courtroom until the very end. Would all of it, the evidence, the recordings, the financial trail, be enough to convince the jury without a direct confession from the accused's own lips? December of 2012 put an end to it. The trial of Moore concluded on the 10th. After long months of preliminary work, interrogations, and hearings, the case finally reached the decisive point, the jury's verdict. The jurors had no doubts. They found Moore guilty of first-degree murder. What the prosecution had assembled proved more convincing than any attempt by the defense to shift the blame onto someone else. 12 people delivered an unambiguous decision. What followed was a punishment that leaves no hope. Moore was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She would never see freedom again. The verdict closed the door before her for good. A woman who had sought profit in another man's wealth lost her own life on the outside. To the main sentence, one more punishment was added. For the use of a firearm in the commission of a serious crime, a minimum term of 25 years was imposed. This wording underscored that, for the court, what had happened was a deliberate armed act, not a fatal twist of circumstance. What exactly convinced the jury is clear. It wasn't any single piece of evidence, but the way they all locked together. Any single piece on its own, the defense might have managed to shake loose. But the revolver, the tapes, and the bank papers all pointed to one place. And there was no room left for doubt. The testimony of a man from her past carried special weight, too. Moore's ex-husband told of that very pit he had dug in April, right when Abraham's life was cut short. An episode that had once seemed like a household trifle turned, in the courtroom, into one more nail in the case. With that, the judicial part of the story came to an end. The crime, hidden for years under a layer of concrete and fake messages, had gotten its name and its punishment. But beyond the verdict remains something no court can resolve. Will Moore ever admit herself what she did? Or will she cling to the end to a version the jury had already stopped believing? The years behind bars shifted nothing in her. Long after the verdict, Moore continues to insist on her innocence. She says she did not do what she was accused of, and holds to this line despite the jury's verdict and the weight of the punishment. The law, however, is unyielding. All her attempts to challenge the verdict came to nothing. Her appeals were rejected. The courts, having considered the defense's arguments, confirmed the original decision again and again. The door that closed behind Moore never opened. A separate, bitter detail is the fate of the money itself, the money for which it all began. Of the $17 million from the win, almost nothing was left by the start of 2010. Some Abraham gave away himself, some flowed to Moore, the rest dissolved into purchases and transfers. The huge fortune that had turned his life upside down vanished almost without a trace. Over time, this story grew beyond an ordinary crime report. People recall it when they talk about how sudden good fortune makes a person a target. The win that millions dream of brought Abraham not happiness, but those who saw him as prey. And the main role in this was played by the fact that the winner's name became public. The case made its way into documentaries about lottery winners. In them, Abraham's story sounds simple. Big money, with no protection and no experience, easily turns from a gift into a death sentence. Abraham Shakespeare himself is remembered for a sad reason. Not for the $30 million, not for the house in the gated community, but for how it all ended, for the yard in Plant City and the layer of concrete over it. And one question remains, to which everyone has their own answer. What is more terrifying, to lose everything you had, or to become a target precisely because you suddenly had far too much?